when my wife informed me that we needed to leave Los Angeles in the mid-90s and we moved up to Eugene, Oregon, I took whatever work I could get, and it happened to be in the video game world. And what I didn't tell my bosses in the video game world was actually what I was doing was building theme park rides. I was using their mechanics. So whether it was a mini golf game or it was, whatever the game I was working on, I was basically creating themed environments. And it was just when 3D was starting to integrate into computer games. And so literally every single thing I've worked on has been just another extension of building a place. And now I use those video game tools to build places. But it really, honestly, I think, Chris, we share this, is that we can't not. This is what we do.
That is former Disney Imagineer Don Carson, who is back for another Imagineering Roundtable, along with our special guest, Chris Merritt, who is also a Disney Imagineer and the co-author of the incredible book, Marc Davis, in his own words, with Pete Docter. It's going to be great. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 130 of the Tomorrow Society Podcast. As always, I am your host, Dan Heaton. Some of my favorite episodes from last year were the Roundtable episodes. I did 2 of them, and it was really the idea of Don Carson, who is a former Disney Imagineer, worked on Splash Mountain, designs for Toontown, so much more. He's been in the industry for decades, and I talked to him first in January of last year, had a great conversation, and then joined Don and Jolyn Cicero and then Andy Sinclair Harris, and he had a really great idea, which was, why don't we get 2 former Imagineers onto one show, and instead of making it more of a look back at their careers, let's just talk about various issues and questions. And that continues today with Chris Merritt. Chris spent a lot of time working for Disney, involved in so many interesting projects. He's also an author who wrote books on Knott's Berry Farm, and lately, like I mentioned in the intro, Marc Davis in his own words, which is a book that I picked up just last month. I cannot believe it took me this long to get it. Incredibly massive, detailed book that Chris co-authored with Pete Docter. And really, I know it cost a lot, but it is worth every penny. I could not recommend a book more. We talk about that a bit, but really what this roundtable is about is Don and Chris talking about what inspired them to become theme park designers, what continues to interest them in the medium, and then beyond that, though, what are some of the challenges that they faced? And I don't just mean challenges like your typical obstacle. A lot of it can be mental or just the toll that it takes to be working basically 24/7 on a project and then know that things are going to change. It may not fit the original vision. And what's that like for 2 people that have been in the industry for long enough to have worked on a lot of different projects, including ones overseas? To me, this was one of the more interesting conversations I've had in the entire history of the Tomorrow Society podcast, and also a lot of fun too. We really hit on quite a variety of points and issues that may face an Imagineer or anyone designing in the theme park industry. So I hope you enjoy this show, and I don't want to use up any more time. Let's get right to it. Here are Chris Merritt and Don Carson. I am really excited for this new Imagineering Roundtable with 2 incredible guests. My first guest is back for his fourth appearance on the Tomorrow Society podcast. He joined Walt Disney Imagineering in 1989, was the lead show designer for Splash Mountain at Walt Disney World. His other projects included Mickey's Toontown, Typhoon Lagoon, parts of Disney California Adventure, and so much more. Beyond Disney, he's also worked in the gaming industry, on virtual environments, on many projects as a freelance designer. It is Don Carson. Don, thank you again for coming back here on this roundtable.
Thanks for having me. It's always enjoyable.
Oh, definitely. It's been a blast every time you've been on the show. My second guest, this is his first time on the show. He has been an art director and show designer on attractions for Walt Disney Imagineering and other companies for 25 years. His work for Imagineering included the Sleeping Beauty Castle walkthrough. He worked on Radiator Springs Racers, multiple attractions for Tokyo and Shanghai Disneyland. He's also the author of Knott's Preserved and Pacific Ocean Park, and most recently co-authored the incredible book, Marc Davis, in his own words, with Pete Docter. It is Chris Merritt. Chris, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Wow, I can't live up to that, but thank you so much for having me.
I think that was actually a very short description of all the things you've done. I think I could have said much more, but I appreciate having you on. I think this is going to be great with both of you here on the show.
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so we're going to talk today about a lot of kind of bigger questions about theme park design and what inspires both of you to do what you do, which I'm excited to do here. Before I do that, I did want to ask one question to each of you about some projects you've done. Chris, of course, I have to ask you a little bit about your book on Marc Davis. So I know you've done some great podcasts, great interviews where you've talked about details why you're interested. I'm just curious for you personally, like what really inspired you to get involved in such an ambitious project? Like what was it about Marc Davis and what he did that interested you so much?
Well, without going into the long and possibly excruciatingly boring history of how I got to know Marc and Alice and was really influenced by them as a Jungle Cruise skipper and a young designer and all that. But I'll say one thing, because I've said that on other shows before, but I will say that when I was able to get to Imagineering, one of the first things I did was go into the IRC, which is the research library that Imagineering has, and would take a look at the amazing collection of all the work that Marc had done. And I was flabbergasted, to see the volume of it, but particularly things that had never been published before, things that the general public had not seen before, because the guy was a machine. I mean, he just cranked out the most gorgeous designs and drawings, one after the other. He was so prodigious. I mean, there are very few other artists at Imagineering who even come close to his output over his tenure there. And I always thought, oh my God, this is so amazing. This has got to be in a coffee table book someday. So I didn't realize at the time that I and Pete would be the ones doing that coffee table book. But just the wealth of that, I always felt rather strongly that there needed to be a really big deep dive look at his work, because his design principles are really the bedrock of what we think of. When we think of classic Disney theme park attractions, I think most people tend to think of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Haunted Mansion, Jungle Cruise, Country Bear Jamboree, America Sings, It's a Small World, Enchanted Tiki Room. Those are kind of things that kind of go to the forefront, I think, of people's minds. And he had such a strong hand in the design of all of those. So just to get that out, but then a plethora of other, there's, a ton of work he did for the Florida parks and for Epcot with the World of Motion. And he really did set the ball rolling on what became the American Adventure at Epcot. And just to find a lot, we didn't even dig up until we got into this project, so many ideas for attractions that never made it, that no one had ever heard of. Like he did this insane show for a pitch for a show. It didn't make it for Monsanto, which was a carousel show, not dissimilar in operation to how Carousel of Progress works. But he did it with Ray Bradbury. And the script is just bananas. And or things like he was pitching a Silly Symphonies themed dark ride at one point. So I just thought it was really important to get all this work out there and to celebrate him. And my only regret is that he didn't live to see it, because I think he would have really enjoyed that.
just looking in the book, I'm amazed because, I knew that he had worked on all those things, but when you see just it back to back to back and the details, like for Country Bear Jamboree, going through every character and seeing his drawings and how close everything was, just as one example. And for so many attractions, it's kind of mind blowing how much of an influence he had not just on those attractions, but what we think of as like a Disney theme park attraction. It's incredible.
Yeah, I thought it was really important that we were able to also kind of prove that by showing and not necessarily telling, although there is a great amount of text and a great amount of, in Marc, as the book title says, it is in his own words, much of it. But I really wanted to prove that. You'll see a lot of juxtaposition in the book of his designs and then the install photos. And I always tried to hew towards choosing photos that were as close to the install date as possible, because he would have art directed that in the field. I thought it was really important to show, here's what his design was and here's how it ended up, and look, they almost overlap,
It's amazing to see. I can't recommend the book highly enough, and it's a real achievement, and I've read a lot of theme park books, so I don't say that lightly.
No, well, thank you.
All right, well, Don, speaking of things that are really cool, the last time you were on, we did talk about pretty much detail your recreation of the original version of Disneyland's Alice in Wonderland, which, again, what I found so interesting recently is I watched your behind the scenes video that you put out a few weeks ago on YouTube, where you kind of explained how it all came together. And the thing that struck me was how many different sources you were using. You have old photos, you have looking at the style of artists, the vintage plan, and you're also working with other artists. Then you're trying to deal with the audio. So how challenging, Don, was it for you and the group to kind of bring all of those different things together into something that was like a coherent whole?
The research part was probably the best, most enjoyable part of it, because we felt a little bit like we were on an archaeological dig site, because we had some reference. We had Daniel Rover Singer, who was an Imagineer at the same time I was, who has a deep love of Alice in Wonderland and that attraction. And he was actually the genesis of us doing that project, was his desire to see it. And we started out with little information, and then just sort of out of the woodwork, we just got little bits coming in from fans who had a little extra piece. That was especially true of audio pieces. It was a joy, and the thing was that we had our heads down so much on getting it done that from the day that Rover said, "Hey, let's do this," to the day we uploaded it to YouTube was only 2 months. I don't even know how that happened.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the most mind-boggling thing, because when I watched the behind the scenes, I thought, this is something someone could spend years on. But I guess that's the world we live in right now. I guess that's the one ability, I guess.
The reason we ended up doing it was basically what preceded it was I had done the Pumpkin Town, which was purely just an excuse for me to talk about the design steps that one could go through as they were designing a theme park dark ride, a really simple traditional dark ride. And when Rover said, "Hey, let's try doing Alice," it was like, well, here's another opportunity to show off the tools that just didn't exist until very recently, that we as designers can leverage to communicate our ideas in a way that allows people to actually ride our ideas even in the earliest days of concept, as opposed to purely just, I have a drawing of what this might look like 5 years from now.
Yeah, totally. And I think that morphs really well into kind of our roundtable type questions, because some of the things we're going to talk about relate to theme park design and how things come together for both of you. So I'm going to start with the first question here for you, Chris, which is, this is a very big question. What are some of the key factors that are involved with taking a great idea and actually delivering an effective final product?
Well, key factors are certainly multifaceted. Mainly just to cut to the chase, budget and time, are the big ones. I was approached recently for a project that was going to go from blue sky to install in 14 months, which is just nuts, So you have to, time and money, which is many things in life. But other than that, from an art director point of view, I think for me, that's a very personal thing. But for me, I always try to hew very closely, if not exactly, to if we're dealing with an IP situation, we're trying to hew very closely to what you see on screen. What's the emotional content in the IP that you're using? So if it's a film or a television program, something like that, where there are characters and things that people are very attached to and very close to, you really want to hit those key moments. I think, for something like the Sleeping Beauty Castle walkthrough, I think even though we were replicating what Ken Anderson had done in 1957, I still think people, expect to see those scenes with Aurora, and they really expect to see those scenes with Maleficent, which had been kind of excised from the 1970s version. So for me, aside from budget and time issues, which are big issues to be sure, I try to hew very closely to what the look and the feel of the film is, if not copy things outright, because I think there are things that are people looking for in these experiences. You're a fan of the Cars movies by Pixar, and you're going to ride Radiator Springs Racers. There are surprises in that attraction that are not in the film, but there are key moments that are lifted right textbook out of the film. And I do think you have to strike a balance between those things. I think Don, I'm sure, is familiar with this. There's a phrase in the industry like, "Oh, you just did a book report," where you've just, like some of the Fantasyland dark rides are book reports where they're just scenes taken straight out of the film, and you're seeing scene after scene. So, but there are some things that I think people do want to see in that vein.
One of the reasons I was so excited that Chris and I were going to get to talk together is that I realized that probably he and I have worked on more DreamWorks IP projects together. I can't tell you how many IP we've done with DreamWorks characters. But one of the things that we definitely stick to the film as far as pulling a lot of the moments, but we also mine the concept art a lot. And in some cases, sometimes the concept art has stylistic choices that allow us to sort of leverage choices that went into the finished film to allow us to expand it. We recently opened up the DreamWorks water park in American Dream Mall in Rutherford, New Jersey, and it had a very small budget for the size that it had, and we had to stylize the DreamWorks IP tremendously, and where we went to find that inspiration was the concept art, even more so than the film itself. So even though we certainly weren't trying to make a book report, we were trying to capture the essence of those IP and those movies, but we did it through the concept art as much as we did from the film itself.
That's an interesting point, because I think about even just like for that example, or some like your big Galaxy's Edge or something, or Pandora, where it's like, those are very different examples, but Galaxy's Edge, where it's like, well, we want to put in what's happening right now, but is that what the guests want? The guests might want something else. How do we balance that out where it's new, but it's also familiar? How tricky is it to, when you're designing and you're trying to come up with something that's stylistically interesting and conceptual, then also to always have kind of those business side of it in the back of your head? Like, how do you balance that in a way that ultimately makes for a good attraction?
Yeah, it's not always easy, because I always try to be a quote responsible unquote designer, keeping it on budget. I certainly think this is going to sound kind of rough, but I think that's the best way to tell an inexperienced creative director or art director who someone just comes in and comes up with this pie in the sky stuff that is just not achievable for the money that you've been allotted to do these things with. But having said that, you really do want to push it as far as you can, because I feel like at the end of the day, and the reason that I love theme parks so much is that attention to detail, that attention to quality, and that extra step. You put yourself in the place of the guest and how much money they're spending to come to these parks. Just to, especially people who are on a family vacation, I can't even fathom what some people spend. So you really want to do your best to deliver as much as possible in that situation, and sometimes that means getting creative with things. And sometimes that's knowing when not to fall on your sword for something that seems like a big, if you can trade one big thing for 20 smaller or medium things, that's going to, when you spread it all out, is going to give more satisfaction to people, if that makes sense. I would go for the spreading it out with the 20 things, just because there's so much more to take home from a mental, emotional standpoint.
I think to also harken back to your question about, what it takes and bring it to the finished product. It's easy for Chris and I, because we're at the very beginning of the process, to think that we are the process, but really it's about 300 or 400 or 500 other people are going to touch it. And our job is to distill whatever that story is, or what the premise is of the attraction, into something that is easily grokked by the rest of the team. And hopefully, if we do our job right, they'll argue for us the choices that are made. And sometimes those choices have to be fairly simplistic, broad ones that everybody can understand. And then you actually find that people are actually doing the fighting for you. But that's tricky, making sure that you get that right. You want the entire team to own it as much as you feel you do, so that the finished product, with any luck, looks like what you intended it to in the beginning.
And I think, to get back to Marc Davis, not that we're talking about Marc, but he was at selling the idea in a single sketch. And if you can generate a piece of artwork, like Don says, that gets the entire team excited and behind you and ready to fight for you, because you're going to need those people to fight for you with the people who own the purse strings, that's huge. That's not always easy to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the trick. I mean, you see, like I said, with that book where you mentioned the 20 small factors, where I was looking at the Haunted Mansion, and there were things I was like, I don't remember ever seeing that. And what I mean by that is there's so many little things and good touches that I've been on the attraction a million times and haven't even seen it. But that kind of gets me to the flip side a bit of what I asked, which is, time and budget are two huge factors, and obviously having a great concept. But what is an undervalued or lesser known aspect that's really crucial to the design process? Let's start with you, Don.
Well, I'd say that probably, as I said before, this ability to create rules by which the universe of the attraction functions. Certainly for Splash Mountain, there's a world of critters and the worlds of humans. And then our design choices were based upon whether or not the thing was built by a human or a critter. That seems so incredibly simplistic, but it became the backbone of how we all understood how the two aspects of that attraction coexisted. And similarly, when we were working on the water park for American Dream, it did not have enough money for us to recreate Madagascar or the world of Kung Fu Panda. So we went with a very graphic approach. And rather than suggesting that we were delivering on Madagascar for a water park customer, we had the characters come to the water park and infuse it with their personalities, which was a much more graphic overlay as opposed to our attempt to create a jungle.
One thing that has saved me multiple times, this is something I picked up from Rolly Crump. Rolly had left Imagineering in the late 1960s, early 70s, and had done a lot of freelance work. And he designed probably the most charming little dark ride he had ever done for Knott's Berry Farm, called Knott's Berry Tales. And that had a huge impact on me as a little kid. But from a design standpoint, one of the things that I got from that attraction was that ride was certainly not sophisticated at all. All the animatronics were very simple, on-off, very, very simple movements. They were not sophisticated animatronics. I wouldn't even call them animatronics. They were like mechanical gags with, a little bear waving up and down. But what Rolly did that was so brilliant was he flooded the zone with graphics, signage, and wanted posters and amazing. You can imagine Rolly Crump's color sense. And this ride was Crump Unbound. So if you do some Googling, look up Knott's Berry Tales to see some photos of what I'm talking about. But the graphics. And so for me, like, I've always thought, if you don't have the budget, to go to recreate the world in excruciating detail like they've done with the Star Wars properties and the Galaxy's Edge, But you've still got to give the guest a sense of it. Graphics is a really great way to bolster what you have going on. I did a lot of that at Universal Studios Singapore in the Shrek land, and you'll just see even, and then harkening back to what Don said before about using the concept art. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the Shrek aesthetic or the films in general, but what I did find is when I dug into all the concept art, how much work all the artists had done in creating that world. And I found all kinds of graphics and ideas for things that I lifted whole cloth and put, they don't call it Shrekland, they call it Far, Far Away at Universal Studios Singapore. So you'll see areas where we had, long hallways exiting the attractions, and we just had no budget for high-end theming or even fiberglass, stonework replication. We're painting the stones on the wall, but I bumped a lot of that up with a lot of graphics, and some of it, again, these are things that I lifted whole cloth out of the concept art. So signage and graphics, I think, is a good tool to keep in your tool belt.
Without a doubt. And if I can add too, before working at Disney, I worked for the Renaissance Pleasure Fair, and I think my fair budget was like $3,000. And so then to go work on an attraction where the budget was $100 million, I figured that any attraction could fall between those two budgets.
I should mention Knott's Berry Tales. I live in Missouri, so we haven't been out there, California, that much when I was younger, but we went to Knott's Berry Farm when I was 9, which was in 1985. And I rode that, and I remember almost nothing of that trip. I remember the soapbox racers, and I remember Knott's Berry Tales. And now I look back at it, and you watch the videos, which are kind of not great online quality because it's older.
Right.
And it's hard. There's so much going on. I mean this in a good way. It's hard for your brain to almost wrap your head around everything you see, because without a clear vision, you're writing it, you're looking at all, like you said, all the graphics, but it shows just how effective that was. Because again, I remember it being really cool, even as a 9-year-old. Right. And why would I remember that, however long it's been a long time since I wrote it.
Well, the good news is, it looks like Don's COVID lockdown, Keep Yourself Occupied project was the Alice 58 recreation. My lockdown project has been, I'm doing a new book on the history of Knott's Berry Tales. And we're working with Rolly Crump on it, and he's writing the intro. But we've spent all summer and fall of last year tracking down every single person who was still around who worked with Rolly on it. We found concept art and photos, construction photos, and really beautiful photos of the actual attraction. They're all going to go in this book, and hopefully it's going to coincide. They're actually redoing the ride. It's going to be in a different format, but that's going to hopefully be open by this next summer. So that book will hopefully be out by then. I'm still working on the first draft, but we've got so much stuff to show. So I think, you show people a video of Knott's Berry Tales and they go, all right, whatever. And, but riding through it was a very different experience, as you say. And I think some of these photos of it will really show what that was.
That's great. That's the one I want to go back in time and ride again.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, because I'm excited about this new version, but it's going to be, I think mostly computer effects and everything, which is cool they're doing it. I think it's going to get people look back at your book and other things, but it's very different. Well,
I'll tell you what, I'll let the cat out of the bag a little bit more. I was lucky enough about 4 weeks ago, they gave myself and my co-author a sneak peek at the new ride, and I was actually a little worried. and I'm really glad to say it's wonderful. They put so much more show set in that attraction. It's not just screens. It's really super charming. And Chris Crump wrote it. Rolly's not in shape to write it right now, but Chris wrote it. We all agreed. I think it's a hit. So it's not going to be as it was. It's not a little dark ride with all sets. But boy, they've got a lot of stuff in there. I can't tell you how cute it is.
Oh, fantastic news. Can't wait.
That makes me even more excited to see it, because I want to get back out to Knott's, soon, meaning a relative term, but when I'm able to and everything's open. Yeah. But that sounds super exciting. All right, well, let's get to our next question here, which let's move on a little bit to inspiration, because I think that's a big part of, I know for both of you and your stories, what interested you about being a designer. So let's start with you, Chris, which is a very simple question. I mean, what really inspires you you mentioned you love theme parks, just to be a designer in theme parks?
Yeah, well, I'm sure Don would agree. It's definitely a choice. It's not,
or it could be an ailment, actually.
It could be a chronic symptom of some sort that we desperately need treatment for. I do, when I talk to younger designers, which sounds funny because I think all of us still think we're 20 in our head, and I'm just turned 51. When younger designers come up to me, I do tell them that I say, you need to realize it's a choice and it's not necessarily an easy one. I mean, I've had to pack my family up and go live in Singapore for 4 years or go live in China for 3 years. And you go where the work is. I think the crux of what you're asking is what gets me excited and enthusiastic about it. And I got to say, it really all stems from, I was really lucky enough as a kid in the 70s to get to go to Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm a lot. And those attractions, deep impact on me. And I didn't really realize it until I went to CalArts to study animation. I didn't really come to this realization until I actually got there that I wanted to do theme park design. But the things that Marc and Alice Davis worked on, Rolly Crump, Sam McKim's concept art, John Hench's 67 Tomorrowland is like unparalleled design, and Knott's Berry Farm with Knott's Berry Tales, and then Bud Hurlbut, who designed the log ride and the mine ride at Knott's Berry Farm, Eddie Sato, who I got to work with at Imagineering later on, designed the wacky soapbox racers. All these things that made this huge impact on my 5 to 10 year old brain that stuck with me forever. Whenever I'm thinking of these things, I think about these things and I get excited, just the memories of them and how interesting and different they were and how fascinating they were to me. And so I try to put that in the things that I'm working on. I've worked on several Frozen attractions, and I'll be just fine if I never have to design anything with Frozen ever again. But I still try and put that excitement in there because there are kids who are going to ride that and they're going to have the same experience that I did. I don't know, Don, if you had the same, what's the word I'm grasping for? If you had the same
epiphany.
Yes. Epiphany. Yes.
Epiphany. Well, absolutely. And that was actually one of the reasons I was excited to get a chance for us to talk, was that I could see our kindred spiritness in the work that you have been posting. And my genesis moment was when my grandparents lived in Anaheim. We grew up in San Francisco, and we would go, and as a 7-year-old, I was incredibly terrified of the Haunted Mansion, like just hid under my mother's jacket the entire time. Right. And we had a couple of years where the income was kind of like it is right now, it was a little tight. And so we didn't make trips down to Disneyland. And I was about 9, and I realized I'm going to go to Disneyland and I'm still going to be under my mother's coat through the Haunted Mansion. So I decided that I would learn how all the effects were done. And most of that there was no internet. So most of it was deduction. And so here I am showing up as a terrified 9-year-old to ride the Haunted Mansion. And I realized that I was completely, utterly fascinated by the effects. And I had not realized before the attention to detail that was happening in the grates over the doors, or the handles on the rope stanchions, or the wallpaper. And then I stumbled out of the Haunted Mansion and realized that those things were happening throughout the entire park. And finally, the last sort of pushed me over the edge and made me realize that this is what I wanted to do for a living. My sister and I were walking through Frontierland, and they were cleaning up or refurbishing what was the Mexican restaurant that next to Big Thunder. And so they'd taken all that adobe, the mud adobe walls, and they'd painted it basically beige. So it didn't look old anymore. It looked like they just painted it with latex. And there was this painter guy on a ladder with a coffee can and a cigarette, because that's what you did when you were working as a painter at Disneyland. And he had this goop, and he was dripping it down the walls of this newly painted adobe and scrubbing it in and making it look like it was old. And from that second, I went, that's what I'm going to do for a living. That's a job. That's what I want to do for a living. And there was no easy path. Awesome. In 1977 to go call up and someone at WED and say, I want to be hired by you. But that feeling, and then lastly, the realization that I'm in a boat with a pirate ship firing cannons over at a fort and I'm actually physically only about 100 yards away from my parents' parked car. That blew me away, that one could create a place that was so incredibly immersive. So all those emotional experiences are sort of my Geiger counter or my dowsing when I work on anything. Am I able to transport people into places that are as deep and as rich as the experiences I had as a kid?
Those are great. I mean, just great to hear those stories. And now, kind of on a related note, though,
Don said it much better than I did.
You both of them were great. I'm not judging. I thought both were excellent. I'm impartial, but I will say too, though, I have a kind of a related question because you both come in big fans of theme parks. You were interested in doing this up front. And obviously, both of you have worked at Imagineering. You've worked on other projects, like you've both mentioned. As you've kind of gone along as a designer, how have your working in the industry, how has it changed even what you're interested in or how you approach things? Because obviously you could I'm not talking about really being jaded. I'm more just what you're interested in. How has that changed as you've gone? I'll ask Don first.
Well, I think I've been thinking about that specifically in sort of the arc of a career. And I'm in my late 50s, so I'm a little further along in the decrepit scale from Chris. But I when I think of myself as an 8-year-old, I think of myself like with my tongue out, sitting on the kitchen table drawing. And then you go to school and you learn how to be an artist. And then you march into the world to conquer it with your art. And then you feel as though that the work that you're doing is all about the project you get to work on. And then I'd say in midlife, you all of a sudden realize that the actual project you're working on is not as important as who you get to work with. Sometimes some of my absolute favorite attractions that I've worked on or any project I've worked on were my favorite because of who I got to collaborate with. And as I'm getting older, I'm realizing that I'm more in a mind space to give back to young people who were in the position I was in the early 80s to help them make the life choices. And I can feel that the trajectory is that I'm eventually going to end up back at 8 with my tongue out drawing on the kitchen table. And that each of those phases brought a certain kind of joy and fulfillment. But I am personally finding that I would say that I am as pleased with how Alice came out as I am any physical thing I've ever done. And that was utterly because of the conversations and the collaboration I had with the people around me. And I would argue that I actually created a rideable attraction that you could experience. Unfortunately, it's not made of concrete, but that doesn't mean it's not potentially as enjoyable.
Yeah, but it's so wonderful that you did that, and I think we need to do that more with more lost attractions because unlike the medium of film, the medium of theme parks is you can't go back and revisit it. Once it's torn out, a film is a film and you can revisit it like an old friend anytime you want. And those feelings of nostalgia come back. But, I can't ever ride Adventure Through Inner Space again. I can't ride Knott's Berry Tales as I rode it as a kid again. I can't ride Nature's Wonderland like I experienced it as a little kid again. And I miss that, So I think it's really actually important what Don did with the Alice 58 VR. That's as close as you're going to get.
That wasn't an option until we were done. So even though it doesn't completely give it back to us as a physical experience that we can smell the grease and hear the bleeding of the scenes through the very way too thin walls.
Right.
We do get to have at least some kind of inkling of what it must have been like.
To talk about Florida stuff, it kills me. I never got to experience Horizons.
Oh no!
I will never experience Horizons, the way it once was, and so if that's as close as you're going to get, so I think the kind of research, the things that Don and I are both fans of the history of these things. I think it's really important to document these things as much as you can because how else are future generations going to know about it?
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, you just mentioned Horizons, the ones that I wrote as a kid that really I missed the most are Horizons, World of Motion, Imagination, plus If You Had Wings and some of the other Tomorrowland things that I wrote in Florida. or, Great Movie Ride and some of the more recent ones. But, so that's really important though, because I think about it, I know there's some great YouTube videos that have been put together of those,
right?
But it's not the same as even something to another level. And I wish there were ways, even what you did was amazing, but even officially, I feel we talked about this on the last roundtable, actually, Don. Officially, I feel like, especially given with all of us at home, there's a need from people, if the company was interested, I think, in doing something like that. And I don't totally understand why not. I'm sure there are reasons, but I think it'd be amazing for fans to see.
I do question, and Chris, you'd know better than me, but my guess is that they probably don't have as much perspective on their own product as maybe people on the outside.
Yeah, without getting into it too much, I think maybe, Don, you've experienced this. It's not always a benefit to your career to be a passionate fan of the history of it. So I will say that. One thing I want to say, you mentioned If You Have Wings, which again is something I never got to experience. But don't you think If You Had Wings is kind of Claude Coates' sister attraction to Adventure Through Inner Space? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of similarity in the vehicles and how they move, and the overlapping use of projection juxtaposed with the show set. Very interesting. That's another one I wish I could go back in time and ride.
Yeah. Although I still have the song in my head.
Oh yeah. Sorry about that.
That's the earworm of all earworms.
Yeah.
Yeah, I referenced that because I mentioned that same trip. I rode Adventure Through Inner Space, and I remember we were like, "Oh, this is kind of like If You Had Wings." It's like, it's similar, because again, especially the introduction where you kind of go by the microscope and go through. That is very similar, ride system, the whole deal. Well, Chris, I also have to ask you too, though. I mean, in your career, how has kind of your perspective changed? Just what you're interested in.
Boy, you mean just in totality of like all art and culture? Or? Well,
you can take it however you would like. I know that's probably too big for one answer, but just something that's really changed for you in terms of an interest.
Well, because you kind of, one of you or both of you kind of joked about being jaded, but I think you kind of can't help but get, the longer you go on, you do get jaded about certain things. You do. I know for me, when I was in my 20s, I was definitely very starry-eyed and came at it with, oh my God. In fact, I'll never forget, I was really fortunate in that I got my toe in the crack at Imagineering thanks to my good friend Larry Nicolai. And the first thing I worked on was the model for the Sinbad attraction. And Larry was really nice and knew I wanted to be a designer and let me design some of the elements of that show. But mostly I worked on the model. And I just remember that first week I was there. And it's so funny now because in retrospect, after doing the Marc Davis book, realizing how important that space I was in. I was working in the Mapo facility, and the far end of the Mapo facility has a model shop. And that model shop was basically the R&D area of WED when they moved over from the studio to Glendale in the 1960s. So, like Bob Gurr, Roger Brogy, and guys like Wayne Jackson and some of these early machinists, like all worked in that space. Anyway, so we were working on the Sinbad model in that space. I, of course, didn't know that at the time, but I just remember I was working on the paper version of the model and taking Larry's drawings and making black and white Xeroxes of them and shrinking them down to scale and spray mounting them onto foam core and cutting them out with X-Acto knives and making this this first version of the model before we got into sculpting. And I just remember thinking, wow, I could die happy right now. Like, this is the coolest job in the world and I'm getting paid for it. I mean, that's amazing to me. So I'm not as starry-eyed as I was in my 20s. But I think it is really important, no matter if you get jaded or burned out, because these projects, especially when you relocate and go overseas, it's really easy to burn out. It's a lot of fast, on your feet design. You're racing against the clock. You're racing against the money, and how do you keep your spirits up? And I think it's really important to try and tap into that sense that 10-year-old kid who rode the Jungle Cruise, in Anaheim, or who rode, Bud Hurlbut's Mine Train ride at Knott's, and what a sense of wonder you have. I think it's really important to try and keep that as part of you, because there are a lot of people in our industry who I've just seen it beaten out of them. And you see it in their face, man. I mean, you just see they're done, they're done. I don't ever want to get that way.
Yeah. Well, that's never ask the designer what his feelings are about the thing he just finished, because they can only see the missed opportunities and the cuts.
Oh my God. It's so funny you say that, Don, because if I could steal a story from Eddie Sato, so when I first met Eddie, it was before I got the chance to, I worked with Eddie on the Winnie the Pooh ride for Tokyo, but before that we were friends.
Classic. An absolute classic.
Yeah, that's my favorite one. And but anyway, Eddie, I did a little student paper on the history of Knott's Berry Farm's Roaring Twenties section, and I interviewed Eddie. So I was like 22 or something, 23, and I interviewed Eddie about his work on the Wacky Soapbox Racers, which I loved. I still love. I think it was genius work. And Eddie is an amazing designer and just an amazing person in general. But anyway, I remember asking him, I said, so, you worked really hard. You got the Wacky Soapbox Racers open and that first opening day, and, you're sitting there watching happy, guests ride it and come out of the exit. And what are you thinking? And he told me, he said, it was awful. I hated it. I was so depressed. I sat there on a bench because, so much of what he wanted was value engineered out of the show. Like they just couldn't afford to do it. And so he sat there focusing on all the stuff that didn't make it and all the stuff that didn't, and his wife said, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you happy? Look at all these happy people. And he said, so that's your curse as a designer, to know what your intent was and, and what it actually is. I don't know where I'm going with that other than that's a thing.
Well, I swear for the 10 years after Toontown opened, we would go to visit the park as a family, and my wife would say, do you want to go to Toontown? I'd say, no.
Yeah.
Just no.
See, I got to say, I am such a fan of Don's work on Toontown. Like, Don's artwork was some of the stuff that I would look at in the library when I was, just starting there. I'd be like, oh my God, look at this amazing zippy cartoony style. And then when Toontown opened, I was like, look, like they got, they didn't use any straight lines in the architecture and how hard that must have been. And it was all related to him and Joe Lanzicero's designs. So I look at it, having not worked on it at all, and I'm like, oh my God, it's amazing. Whereas, Don probably never wants to see it again.
Well, I have stories, but the gift, the gift of the, reading through, cover to cover, both covers of the Marc Davis book was realizing what humans they were.
Yeah.
And it was even descriptions of where Marc would come up with gags, and they were seen as gags by other Imagineers. And then some wouldn't get in because there just wasn't room for them.
Right.
It wasn't because they weren't good gags. It was just wasn't room for them. And his sort of frustration that my favorite gag didn't make it in, that's the reality of this job. I'm sorry, there's an air conditioned duct going where you wanted that pivotal moment to be.
Oh yeah. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about architects. You've got to draw, you're working on a project, right? You've got a drawing package and you're reviewing it and you're like, okay. And then you get out into the field and you find a freaking HVAC duct has been put right in the middle of your show set. And you're like, damn it. Like where did this thing go? Sorry, princess. You got to deal with it. And that's where I think a lot of the artistry comes in, by the way, is like being in the field and like, dealing with that stuff and still making it look cool. But Don, what you were just saying about Marc, not getting all his gags in. Even worse is the Enchanted Snow Palace. At the end of his career there, where he comes up with he's trying to pitch projects like, let's do something. And he does the Enchanted Snow Palace, and it's the most, if you've looked at the book or the artwork, it's the most gorgeous, beautiful, jaw-dropping, watercolors you've ever seen. Great idea for an attraction. And Marc told me he couldn't even get any of the executives to come in and look at it, or the few that would go, oh, that's nice, and then they'd walk right out again. And it started, and he let it get to him. I mean, to be frank,
it's hard not to.
Right? Like he just, there's a story it's in the book from another colleague of his where after that happened enough times, he just kind of sat there looking out his window, looking out at Flower Street, just kind of staring, which was not like him at all. Mm-hmm. So the part of the problem is with these projects, and again, I'm sure, Don, you can relate, is you do put so much of yourself in them. And so if you're working like, I don't know, a 9-to-5 job where you're not emotionally invested in the outcome and you've put so much of yourself in it, I think it's real easy to go, okay, whatever on this one. But when you're emotionally invested with it, that can be a really hard thing to deal with.
Yeah.
Rolly, sorry to go on and on, but one other quick thing. Rolly Crump told me a similar thing when I was in my early 20s and I was trying to figure out how to break into the industry. And I was visiting Rolly along with Marc and Alice. Rolly had an avocado ranch out just near San Diego at one point, Fallbrook. And he said, all right, kid, you want to learn, you want to get into this industry? And he sat me down under an avocado tree and told me like all the really awful stories that can never be printed, right? Of like his time at WED and how he was treated by some people. And that, that was, and of course so he said, you still want to do it? And I said, yeah, of course I still want to do it. Cause I was, 22, but that you have to really love this medium and you give up a lot to do it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. My story is that I'm pretty mild-mannered. I'm hopefully relatively easy to work with. We were working on Toontown, and we were in the field. And when you build buildings that don't have straight lines and they all do like really wacky things, stuff happens. And things that you had thought were precious just have to go back in the truck because there's just no room for them. So there was 100 times a day where you were having to go, well, I guess it's going to look like this then. You were just constantly trying to see if it still retains the look you were trying for. And at one point, I get a call on my radio when we had radios back then that they were pouring the concrete slab around the Toontown trolley, and that they were pouring it wrong. And I went, oh, okay. So I get there, and sure enough, the truck was just about to pour concrete on this thing. And I said to the person who I will not mention in management, this is incorrect. And he said, well, we're following the drawings you signed off. And I said, well, show me. And so we went to the construction thing, and they showed me they were looking at a drawing package where that curb was the size of my fingernail. And I dug into the pan and I said, no. And I opened up, there was a diagram that showed just that curve with my signature on it. And I said, that is what you're supposed to pour to. And I said, but I signed this. This is what you're supposed to do. He said, no, we're following the detail that's really small. So I said, no, you really, really have to pour it this way. It's how it was designed. So they poured it. And then the guy took me by the arm and he led me away from the site. And he said, look it, one day you're not going to get everything the way you want it. And the only time in my entire career, I just exploded. I just could not believe I had spent, months, everything was a compromise to try to get it to all work. And afterward, my fellow designers, including Joe, said, are you all right? And I said, I have never felt better in my entire life. I had burned everything out. But that's really, really, to answer like the very first questions you were asking, so much of our work is shepherding this herd of cats towards this one agreed upon design aesthetic, and knowing along the way there's on a daily basis going to be 100 things that are asked of you to reevaluate whether or not your choice really is that important.
Man, you gotta live there. You have to live there in the field when you're in production and you're building it, because if you don't, you will just get screwed. and if Don hadn't been there for that, you know what I mean? And so that didn't mean anything to those other people, but it meant something to Don, who, did the design. Kind of a fun, this is really wonky. Don, have you seen, both of you know what cloud revisions are, right? On shop drawings.
Yeah.
Yes. So a cloud revision is if you're getting architectural drawings back from, whoever's designing what the vendor in the field is going to build, you make notes around things that people will make a little bubble around it. It's in a little cloud shape. So it's called a cloud revision. And there's this great, I'll have to dig it up for you. There's this great picture going around there. So someone put a cloud revision on a shop drawing, and then they got out to the field and someone actually dug into the concrete, dug out a cloud shape that matched the cloud revision bubble exactly. But that happened because that person was not there to see them do it or catch them doing it. It's you have to live there, and that can get exhausting. I mean, I remember in the castle walkthrough, I had to be, there in meetings all day, 9 to 5, and then come back at 2 a.m. when the night shift was doing their work. Because if I didn't, by the time I got back at 9 a.m. the next morning, something would be installed wrong. And once it's installed, you're going to have a big fight with your project manager about uninstalling it and making it right.
It's money,
Right. Yeah.
Jackhammering out that concrete thing they poured wrong. It costs money.
Oh, yeah. One of the scenes in the castle walkthrough, at some point in the 70s, they moved this massive transformer in there, and they had to relocate that transformer for us to get all our show set in there. That was a big deal. Things like that, you have to be on top of it. Yeah. This is really probably way too wonky for your audience.
No. This is great. I'm enjoying this. I'm almost like I'm in the audience right now. This is wonderful. But I mean, really, I have to follow up to that because I really want to know though, because I mean, the way you describe it, like you mentioned, Chris, with burnout and such, when you're designing something you put so much heart into, whether it's Toontown or anything, how do you survive? What do you do mentally or physically? How do you cope with that in order to stay in the industry and not burn out? Because both of you have been in the industry for a long time. So Chris, I'm curious.
I don't know if this is a great answer for you, but I just feel like, in my career, this is what I do. This is what I trained to do. This is what I decided I wanted to do in my 20s. When I was at CalArts, I've told this story before, but I went to CalArts for character animation. And after my first year of animating, I really decided, I really don't want to be an animator. I can't sit there drawing pose after pose after pose all day long. And, I don't have the patience for it. And I just went, I really want to do theme park design. But, back then, in the early 90s, much like Don, how do you learn how to do this? There was no way to learn how to do this. There weren't even hardly any books or any information on the history of these things. You had to find it out for yourself, which is one of the reasons I tracked down Marc and Alice Davis and Rolly Crump and people like that so I could ask them. But, for me, I've invested so much energy and passion into this. And I when I'm working, which a lot of us aren't right now because of the COVID situation, but I'm pretty good at what I do. And so it just feels like this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is really, certainly there's always times to pivot in your life and try new things. And maybe that's what I'll end up doing. But for me, I just have a deep, deep love for this. And I've invested so much time and passion and a lot of my life into it. I can't imagine not doing it or not caring about it. I don't know if that solves the burnout question or not.
Well, I'd say that I think one of the reasons we do it is because we can't not do it. That when my wife informed me that we needed to leave Los Angeles in the mid 90s and we moved out to Eugene, Oregon, I took whatever work I could get, and it happened to be in the video game world. And what I didn't tell my bosses in the video game world was actually what I was doing was building theme park rides. I was using their mechanics. So whether it was a mini golf game or it was, whatever the game I was working on, I was basically creating themed environments. And it was just when 3D was starting to integrate into computer games. And so literally every single thing I've worked on has been just another extension of building a place. And now I use those video game tools to build places. But it really, honestly, I think, Chris, we share this, is that we can't not. This is what we do.
Totally. Yeah, both those answers make a lot of sense to me, and they totally hit on the burnout question, Chris. So that's totally cool. So I want to finish with one question that's kind of a bigger question related to kind of how both of you view attractions when you're a designer. And, there's attractions that have been amazing, high-tech things that haven't done that well. And then there's other ones that are fairly simple that have become classics that you just look at and you go, that's a classic attraction. So I'll start with you, Don. Looking at it from like a designer's perspective, what do you think, what makes a difference in really making an attraction become a classic versus just something that's okay?
I reflect on the movie industry and that there is not a single movie production, no matter how low budget, that went out of their way to make a bad movie. They were all going to make the movie that was going to change everything. And I think that every attraction, everybody's pouring themselves into making the best thing possible. And then for whatever reason, it is pushed away by the public or embraced and loved by the public. And sometimes that attraction can be loved despite itself. I remember when in the mid to late 90s, early 90s, actually, when the Muppets were owned by Disney for the first time, they were talking about actually replacing Mr. Lincoln for a Muppet animatronic show. And it was like picketing. People were so angry. Now, granted, these are the same people that wouldn't be caught dead going in there unless they needed air conditioning. But the way they were passionate. So what defines a classic is often out of our hands. So that really it boils down to we just make the best thing we possibly can, hope that we poured as much love and attention into it. And then also there's the other thing, too, that I think that sometimes attractions that have gone away that were much loved, if you had a chance to go back to them, you probably wouldn't love them as much. Probably kind of like the at one point I made the mistake of watching HR Puffenstuff on YouTube.
Oh my God, I was just going to say this. Sorry, interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, my childhood was a lie. It was definitely more ragtag than my memory of it. I have fond memories of it. I think also that was part of the opportunity to do the Alice thing for Rover. He wanted to do it because he just thought the thing was as freaky and odd and strange compared to what we do now. But that freaky, odd strangeness is what makes it so great. It causes you to reflect on the mechanics and the technology and the personalities and talents of the time, like an archaeological dig. So I don't know. And I think having been alive long enough that I said, oh yeah, I remember as a kid we were watching the Frost and Nixon interview, and a woman who was in her late 30s went, "You were alive then?" Sometimes, yes, it wasn't that long ago. That sometimes things are considered classics purely because they're older. Like, I can't believe you were there, but you ate at the Big D back in the early 90s.
Oh God.
So it's all relative. Yeah. And I also think the other thing too is that it depends on who grew up with it, that sometimes the things we love that we grew up with, we love because we grew up with them. And they become classics because they're just utterly connected with our childhood. We have our own mini Ratatouille moment when we ride something that we rode as a kid, so it becomes a classic in that respect.
Yeah. I don't think very many people were thinking about how Los Angeles was in the early 1970s, and were really super nostalgic. I think the amount of people who are really nostalgic for that and what was being played on the radio then are probably relatively small. And then Quentin Tarantino does his Once Upon a Time in Hollywood film, and he just brings that alive. So to your point, Don, some dinky little thing that even if you could get in your time machine and go back and visit, and maybe it would not be so impressive. Maybe it means more to someone who grew up with it and have that fleeting memory of it. I know, I feel that way about Nature's Wonderland. I've got these very Zapruder-like memories of riding that, and one of them is seeing the bobcat on the cactus balancing back and forth, or going into Rainbow Caverns, or seeing the rocks rolling back and forth. That would probably be pretty dippy to people today.
You couldn't design that from scratch.
Right.
To look like that.
Right. Yeah, it's its own thing, or even, dare I say it, Knott's Berry Tales. As much as I look at these beautiful photos we're going to put in the book, and it takes me right back, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was so wonderful. But maybe to someone else, or maybe someone who doesn't appreciate Rolly Crump's design aesthetic, because Knott's Berry Tales was basically Crump let off the leash to do whatever the F he wanted, which he did do. It's pretty wacky. I don't know. I do know. I could say something along the lines of, you kids, things were better when they were simpler back then. But I got to tell you, Rise of the Resistance is the most, and I didn't work on that at all, gobsmacking, jaw-dropping attraction you'll ever ride, and that's the most complicated thing in the world. It's like 3 freaking ride systems jammed into one. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's an answer to it other than I just think as a designer, you have to put as much of your heart and soul into that. And then also, just like I said before, keep remembering that those other 10-year-old kids who are going to experience it and have their memories with it. It's that's a big topic.
Well, you bring up a few things. I think about Epcot too, because I look back so fondly on going as a 8-year-old, 10-year-old, whatever. And I'm like, do I have too much nostalgia for Kitchen Cabaret and, or something? It's so weird, but would I love it if it opened now? And then I think about music too, because I think about my favorite bands. A lot of them are bands that I listened to from like 1992 when I was 16 to 1998. And why do those resonate so much more strongly than maybe a band that I discovered 2 years ago? Some of it is when it hits you. I think it's a big part of it with theme parks, or like you mentioned, with movies or anything. It's we could probably do a whole show on this. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're the most emotionally raw in our teen years too. Our young, our receptors are much more open for that when we're kids.
Right. I've heard it said that, emotionally and in terms of accepting new things, whether it be art or culture or music or what have you, we all have our windows wide open from the time that we're small children until, we hit our 20s. And that window starts closing a little bit more each year. And I definitely have to say, for me, I was a teenager in the 80s. And I'm a big vinyl nerd, Luddite, and so for me, my favorite thing is to listen to all my favorite bands from the '80s, on vinyl, the way I used to when I was 16 and going to see The Cure or Bauhaus or New Order or whatever. That's still my favorite. My first choice. There's lots of other bands I like that I've listened to. I love Jack White and the White Stripes, and just got into Amy Mann again recently. And but I do find, I don't know if you two can relate to this, but I find every year that it's harder for me for someone to say to me, "Hey, there's this new band." And check them out. And I'm like, all right, I'll try. But 9 times out of 10, I'm not interested. Just once in a while, something will kick in then.
That's a question I was wondering too, is that I remember as a young artist, I would go to bookstores when there were bookstores to go to, and I was like a vacuum cleaner sucking up information. And now when I go to a bookstore, my wife criticizes me. She said, you only buy books with art that looks like yours. It's like I'm almost like really honing in on a very specific aesthetic, and so I'll snatch up a book where someone is exploring something that I'm exploring.
Yeah, I'm on a cryptozoology kick right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could go on about music from my childhood forever too, but just going back to theme parks, I think that's, for me as a guest, being wowed, it takes a lot. But I think about writing Flight of Passage and be like, oh yeah, it's a screen, whatever. And I got on it and I was like, oh my gosh. And it's like, there are still moments like that, but I think it's a little trickier for us now. And I'm sure it is for you sometimes. Something like Rise of the Resistance can blow you away, but it's that inexplicable thing. You don't always know when it's going to hit you.
No. Well, I have such fond memories of Circle Vision.
Yeah.
Right? It's a big circle picture. And I'm thinking, VR, duh, come on, guys, export this file, and so I can see it. I do wonder whether or not it will be binge-worthy as far as the way it depicts America and the music and so on and so forth. But in some ways, that's exactly why I want to see it. I want to be transported back to when I was a kid going to see that and experiencing it.
Sure. I'm fairly obsessed with, and I think this will be a book I'll do, of turn of the century Coney Island, particularly Luna Park and Dreamland and the original Steeplechase. Before they even get to even the 20s is too far for me. That late 1800s, early 1900s.
Before it burned to the ground.
Right. That those three parks had, and then all the little wacky attractions that surrounded them. I'm fascinated. I'm completely fascinated. I want to see that stuff recreated in VR so I can, jump in my time machine and visit them again. Just even things like if you look at Thompson and Dundee's A Trip to the Moon attraction, which was at Luna Park, but was at the Buffalo, New York World's Fair prior to that. that's the original, what do you want to say, ride simulation, where, for your listeners who don't know the history of a trip to the moon, it's fascinating because, again, this is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You actually got on a physical, quote unquote, ship that would fly you to the moon through the use of theatrical scrims that were on giant rollers that were the size of the Flight of Passage building, right? Guys are back there cranking these things by hand to make it look like you're flying, away from Coney Island and up to the moon. And then you actually land on the moon. You actually get off the ship and you walk around the surface of the moon where, midgets dressed as moon men hand you pieces of real green cheese, and moon maidens serenade you, and you meet the king of the moon. And then you walk out through a moon dragon's mouth that dumps you back down, into Luna Park. I want to visit that, man. I think that's so cool.
That was my kind of hope with doing the Alice project, was that I wanted to illustrate just how doable that is. And as an aside and as a future-looking sort of comment, is that I'm working on a side project with some friends, and we had a meeting, and then we decided we needed to build some models. And our next meeting, we all met inside the models using Quest VR and a program called VSketch, which lets you go into SketchUp models. And we gained so much knowledge in our second meeting about which direction we wanted to go in, because we walked through like 6 versions of the venue and picked from it the things that worked. And, whether it's the metaverse or whatever this thing is going to become, the ease at which we can recreate places, very much like, attraction from Luna Park, those tools are available and actually kind of easy to use. And we're starting to standardize the pipeline for getting them in front of people. If ever you get funding to build that, I'm there with you, Chris.
Right. We'll talk.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, this has been amazing, guys. I could do this all day, but I think I'm going to land the plane now. This is fun. Chris, I'm really excited about your book that you're working on Knott's Berry Tales, and about the attraction. For me, who doesn't know that much beyond what I read in like the book about Rolly Crump about it, this is really exciting. So thanks for being on the show, and I'm super excited about your book.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, Don, I'm excited to see what you're still doing here with VR, and obviously the Alice project is great, and I know there's going to be so much more, but thanks for coming on the show once again. It's been great.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always fun.
Well, that was great. I would definitely recommend you check out the other 2 roundtables. You can find them and more at tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. If you'd like to support this show, there's a great way to do so by becoming an official member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. Learn more by going to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. And don't forget to submit your ideas on ways to improve Tomorrowland at Disneyland for a future podcast. Submit those before February 10th. Send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I'll be talking with Imagineer Jim Clark about his time at Disney, including the recent Enchanted Tale of Beauty and the Beast attraction in Tokyo. So excited to talk to Jim about this and a lot more. Thanks so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.